Okay, it's good evening for me. Good morning for you, I guess. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Bruce. As Bruce says, we've been friends probably for more years than we care to remember, and it's a great pleasure to be talking to you all. I'm going to say something fairly provocative, which is that a likelihood ratio, in spite of what you've been told, is meaningless. Which is true, it's just a number. A likelihood ratio is just a number, unless it relates to a clearly specified pair of propositions. And I find that this is so often missed and overlooked. And indeed, when it comes to the evaluation of evidence, formulation of a meaningful pair of propositions is not only the most important part of evidence interpretation, it's also the most difficult part. It can be excruciatingly difficult. And I sense that this is why often this stage of evaluation is not given the attention that it deserves. I hear a lot of talk about the likelihood ratio framework. There is no such thing. It's not the likelihood ratio framework. What we're looking for is a logical framework for reasoning in the face of uncertainty. And what we're looking for is the means of providing a court of law with a personal assessment of weight of evidence, provided by a set of observations in relation to a pair of clearly stated propositions. And what I'm talking about is nothing new, but people tend to be rather afraid to say this, but the logical approach to evidence evaluation in a criminal trial is founded in the Bayesian paradigm. And I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean by that. But what I'm talking about is nothing new. This really is quite old stuff. And if you're interested, I think the first instance which most people believe is the first instance of the application of Bayesian reasoning in a criminal trial was in relation to the appeals of Dreyfus, the Dreyfus trials in France around about the turn of the century, of the 20th century, that is, where evidence was given, compelling evidence was given, by a great man, a great mathematician, Poincaré, in relation to evidence which had already been given by Bertillon. And he was effectively saying that what Bertillon was saying was what we now call the prosecutor's fallacy, which I sense you'll be hearing about elsewhere in this course. And our colleagues in Lausanne have really tied that down as perhaps the first instance of really sound logical reasoning in forensic evidence evaluation. There's a very interesting period in the Second World War, which is not forensic, but nevertheless, in their work on cryptography, the great Alan Turing, with his colleague Jack Good, did a lot of work on weight of evidence. And their arguments were essentially Bayesian arguments, and the notion of weight of evidence emerged as the logarithm of the likelihood ratio. But in forensic science itself, The paper that for me is the milestone is one written in the Harvard Law Review in 1970, a great paper by a statistician and a lawyer, Finkelstein and Fairley, which I say is a very, very important paper, and I'd recommend anybody to go back and read that. And look at it in the context of 1970, look at it in the context of today. It stands the test of time. Thinking in the UK evolved to quite a big extent as a result of the work of this man, who sadly is no longer with us. A great statistician, Dennis Lindley, who had a great influence on me. And then the work that I'm going to talk about briefly, albeit briefly, where these ideas really blossomed into a style of approach to the entire undertaking of evaluation casework, evolved in the Forensic Science Service round about the turn of the 21st century. And it was a project which was called Case Assessment and Interpretation. And that project was led by some pretty senior managers in the service, some very senior caseworkers, and a couple of people like me who were statisticians with a background in casework and evidence evaluation. And this was a style of thinking in relation to the top-down. What are we here for? Who are our customers? Who are we working for? What are we aiming to do? And out of that work, there are a number of very important ideas emerged. The notion of weight of evidence, as I say, really depends on the work of Turing and Good. There were others. And the notion that something is put into the scales of justice by us as forensic scientists. And it's really good to think of that in terms of the word support. And as I say, Turing and Good showed that weight of evidence was really sensible to regard it as the logarithm of the likelihood ratio. So within the context of our own project in the Forensic Science Service, the ideas that emerged that were important, they weren't new ideas, they were a conceptualization of what a lot of people have been thinking for quite some time. One idea, a fundamental idea, is that the scientist, when working on an investigation, is a different person from the scientist who's working on the evaluation of evidence for court purposes. There's a different style of thinking. There are behaviors which are acceptable at the investigative stage, which are not effective at the acceptable at the evaluative stage. And the distinction between the investigative and evaluative scientist is a very important one, and it's one that's often missed. We did an awful lot of work on what makes good propositions and what really passes off as faulty or pseudo propositions. We made a distinction between what we call explanations and propositions. I'll be giving you a reference at the end of this, which will give you more information on what that distinction is. And the notion of the hierarchy of propositions. So at one level, we think about source level propositions. Where did this DNA come from? Did this DNA come from this person or another person? There's activity level propositions. Did this person carry out this activity, or did this person carry out some other activity? And there's even offense level propositions. Did this person carry out the murder? So on. The extent to which scientists can address propositions at these different levels is a matter always for debate. But in general, the higher the level up the hierarchy the scientist can go, the greater assistance he or she will be giving to the court of law. And we did a lot of work on presentation of evidence, how our results should be presented in the form of a statement for a court of law. So I mentioned the Bayesian paradigm. You've probably all heard of Bayes' theorem. Well, the Bayesian paradigm actually is rooted on something different from Bayes' theorem. It's rooted on the notion that probability is personal. The really interesting probabilities in this world are not really those of throwing dice, tossing coins that we learn our basic statistics from, but there are much more interesting things like was Henry VI a homosexual? Sorry, that's an English example. The real life questions and the real life probabilities are far more interesting and far deeper than coin tossing. And what is of crucial and central importance is that probability is conditional. Any probability, a probability without a clear statement of what it is conditioned on, is meaningless. And when it comes to real life interesting probabilities, your probability will depend on what you know, my probability will depend on what I know. So it is almost inevitable that our probabilities will be different for the same proposition. It follows from that that there is no correct likelihood ratio. The likelihood ratio is, as you're aware, formed by the ratio of essentially two conditional probabilities. Those probabilities include the judgment of the expert, and so your likelihood ratio may well be different from my likelihood ratio. And at the end of the day, the jury, each individual juror, will form his or her assessment of the likelihood ratio. So if we look at the scientist in this framework, if we start at the top with reference material and question material and the generation of some observations, then these have to be viewed in a framework of circumstances that are relevant to the incident. It is essential to formulate a pair of propositions. Then we generate observations. And then the evaluation will take account of whatever data is relevant. There'll be some kind of model. You've been talking a lot about models, genetic models, I guess. Well, in any area of forensic science, there will be some kind of conceptual model behind what we're doing. We don't all have the same model, different models for different situations. And the scientist will use his or her knowledge, absolutely essential. And related to that, closely related to that, is the judgment of the scientist. All these together go into the formulation of the weight of the evidence. And as I say, laboring the point, these things here are absolutely critical to the whole procedure, the proposition. So for me, the knowledge and judgment of the scientists are paramount in this process. And I find that so many statisticians wander into forensic science and become pretty obsessed about data. For me, data collections are okay, but there is a great tendency to overemphasize their importance. For me, the future is the notion of the well-calibrated scientist. I say knowledge and judgment are important, but not free and unfettered. The scientist's knowledge should be calibrated. Sorry, I skipped that one a bit. So, some references which I've passed to Bruce. They'll be on a list which I'm sure you'll have access to. These recent documents from the ISFG on formulation of propositions are fundamental. These are fundamentally important documents. And there is another document, a British document from our own regulator in the UK, which is on DNA mixture interpretation, with a big emphasis on the formulation of propositions. So I strongly recommend those references to you. And finally, for your bookshelves, this fairly recent book by Robertson, Vigneault and Berger is an excellent book, an excellent introduction to the evaluation of forensic science evidence. And I recommend it, and I think it should be on the bookshelf of every forensic scientist. You can read it from cover to cover. It's certainly not a demanding text. And it's got so much really beautifully written and very important stuff in it. A kind of background book, which is on the theory that would not die. It's about how the importance of Bayes' theorem has taken a long time to get through to people, and it's a bit of a page turner. It's not. It mentions forensic science, but it's not really principally on forensic science. It's a very nice book, which you can get. It's on Amazon, and it's a good read. Mathematically, it's a little bit questionable in places. Maybe not quite as accurate as it should be here and there, but that doesn't matter. It doesn't detract from the overall message. And see, it's a darn good read. And then the Royal Statistical Society in the UK has produced a number of important documents for evidence evaluation. The link, I do not have the link at the moment. These documents are available free from the Royal Statistical.
Yeah, so we can find them, Ian. Thank you.
Yeah, but Bruce has a copy of this one, I know, yeah. And I commend it to you. And that will tell you about hierarchy of propositions and so on. And that's about it.
Thank you, Ian. So started out quite provocative. I'm somewhat relieved that we weren't contradicting each other. I think what you said wasn't exactly opposite what I said in class. I'm ashamed to say. But anyway, it was very nice. It's a very nice overview, and we certainly appreciate you coming. This has been recorded. And Sandra, do we have anything on chat? We've got a couple of minutes. If anybody had a quick question, doesn't look like it. Thank you, Ian. That was very nice, and we'll be in touch. And I think you've opened some people to a new way of thinking. So thank you.
Okay. Bye.
And we'll see you all later. Thank you all.